turn our attention to football, as our next guest is probably thinking, really? You're talking golf while we're trying to talk Eagles-Packers? Hey, John McMullen, how are you, bud?
Talk golf instead of preseason football if you want. Golf's far more exciting than preseason football.
It is a major, and I don't know that there's any times tonight in the Packers-Eagles game that the word major would be used, right? Major Applewhite doesn't play football anymore. It's not a major football game. Is there any point in tonight's game that you think the adjective major would be used?
Well, to some people, it's major. I mean, people love this sport to the degree where they're going to be living and dying on each play and really taking more out of it than they should. I think you can kind of see that from Twitter last night if you're following along with Houston, Carolina. I mean, to some people, they're already, planning to sculpt the bust of Deshaun Watson because he made a couple plays in a preseason environment where nobody was game planning, and certainly it's going to become much more difficult for him. But, hey, people love football, and this will be the first time you get to see the Philadelphia Eagles. So there's no question whether things go well or they don't go as well. People are going to overreact a little bit to what goes on tonight.
Was in a diner last night, John. John McMullen's with us talking Eagles football. I was in a diner last night. Late, had been in a play earlier, which was about football, by the way. It was called Tommy and Me, and it was about Tommy McDonald, which was a really cool play. But after that, my dad and I went to get a bite to eat, and I walked in, and I thought, gee, the Phillies game would be on somewhere, being the Philly sports fan that I am. And, yes, that preseason game was up there in the diner instead of the Phillies game, and that probably speaks volumes. In a diner in South Philadelphia, within a couple of football fields from the complex, they were watching preseason NFL football. It is that time.
Well, I think that says more about the struggles of the Phillies than anything. But obviously, yeah, it's been a disappointing season for the Phillies. So people in Philadelphia are watching Houston, Carolina preseason football. Woo, the Phillies got to take a step back and think about what they're doing because that's kind of sad. But you expect it with the Eagles, obviously. And people, I don't want to downplay it. I understand why people get excited. I just caution that, don't overreact to certain things. If someone looks like a world beater. You remember the Sam Bradford game in Green Bay a couple of years ago? Where
I remember it well.
Basically. Yeah, so understand the Packers have no interest in winning this football game. And obviously you're not going to see Aaron Rodgers. You're not going to get their best. So it's just about evaluating players in individual circumstances and seeing guys in sort of one-on-one live environment, and you take it from there and just build toward the regular season.
John McMullen with us. So, John, before we get into tonight's contest, who's going to go up against who, what position battles we're looking at, and what things we'll take interest out of. There was news last night. In fact, I was in that same diner seat scanning my phone and said, gee, what's this about Brandon Graham? Some contract language they put in that, there's a word major, that could make him some major money.
Yeah, he's got the opportunity. I'm disappointed you don't remember, Pete, because I said that back in May. If you remember when that whole dust-up started and Brandon left the off-season voluntary workouts for a very, very brief time. He went back to Detroit. It was for contract purposes, and the fact that he wasn't necessarily all that happy coming off a second-team All-Pro year, and he was only gone for a very short period of time, and he was magically reappeared, and he called news of potential contract unrest, fake news, and as I predicted at the time, you're going to see something over the summer, and there it was, the opportunity to make basically $1.5 million more. The issue was you have a second-team All-Pro that was scheduled to make less money than Vinny Curry, and, I understand, as I said at the time, why Brandon would be upset by that, and now this sort of rectifies it because if he plays at a level he did last year, it makes the Pro Bowl, is named an All-Pro. He's going to be able to to garner more money. And I predicted there would be a tweak in the contract, and there's your tweak.
John, Nick Costco, thanks for joining us again. We see the first game action tonight. So when you're watching this game tonight, which rookie, either drafted or undrafted, is going to be looked at the most tonight, and what are you watching for?
Yeah, I wrote on 973ESPN.com yesterday. To me, the most important player by far is Rasul Douglas because, number one, because of the position. Obviously, it's the biggest question mark on the Eagles, and you were hoping that he could kind of push for immediate playing time because there's just not a lot of talent outside of cornerback, and he hasn't performed well, to be honest, in training camp to this point. So now that he's going to be going against, obviously, a different team, a different color, a different jersey, different people, hopefully the something clicks on and you could see him get back to where he was in the off season, where he looked like he could be an immediate contributor, because I think it's really, really important that someone on this team starts pushing Patrick Robinson, and that first someone has to be Rasul Douglas.
Switching over to the offensive side now, it seems like the slot wide receiver position is going to be Jordan Matthews as the starter, but right behind him it's being rotated between Nelson Aguilar and Marcus Johnson. Obviously, Johnson has really thrived throughout training camp thus far. So how do you think they're going to divide the reps between Aguilar and Marcus Johnson, and what do you expect out of those two guys tonight?
Well, they're both going to play. I mean, to me, it's been a little bit overblown as far as that slot discussion between Jordan Matthews and Nelson Aguilar, and understandably why. I mean, Jordan was out a lot of the spring work with the knee tendonitis, and Nelson kind of stepped in. But this is an 11-personnel team as a whole, and that means 3 receivers are going to be on the field. So there's going to be plenty of reps for that 4th receiver, which projects to be Nelson Aguilar. But Aguilar is very versatile as well. He can play inside, he can play outside. So he'll be spelling everybody once the regular season starts. He'll, at times, line up for Alshon Jeffrey, Torrey Smith, and Jordan Matthews. As far as Marcus Johnson, he's more of an outside guy. He's not a slot receiver. He's been taking the first-team reps while Jeffrey has been limited with the shoulder injury, and he's online to make the team. But as far as the core group in the top 4 receivers on this team, barring injury, it's going to be Jeffrey, it's going to be Smith, it's going to be Matthews, and it's going to be Aguilar.
John McMullen on 97.3 ESPN.com. Eagles Insider also covers the NFL for FanRag Sports. John, looking at the overall picture of the preseason, we know we're not going to see a lot of the starters. So who do you think are the guys tonight in the next couple of weeks who are going to benefit the most from preseason action?
Well, it's obviously bottom of the roster guys who are going to make their push to not only make the roster, and we talk about people, the biggest name there is probably Marcus Johnson, who has put himself in a position to make this football team. Now it can go one or two ways. If he continues to play the way he has in practice, it's a no-brainer. But if he fails and starts performing poorly, all of a sudden he could be off the roster relatively quickly. I compared him to Chris Pantale last season. If you remember, the tight end, basically Doug Peterson at one point in training camp said he made the football team. And then all of a sudden the game started and he just performed so poorly, he was out of the equation quickly. So things like that can happen. But to be honest, this coaching staff, I was going down the roster the other day. There's probably about 44, 45 guys that you can say are no-brainers. So we're talking about 8 or 9 roster spots and people pushing for that. So it's not a lot, to be honest. There isn't a lot of uncertainty with who's going to be here. So it's important, obviously, for the rookies to get their feet wet. It's important for those bottom of the roster special teamers to kind of distance themselves. But we all know who the core is going to be of this football team.
You mentioned the core of the football team. It's being suggested by some individuals out there that there's a quote-unquote competition for not the starting quarterback, but the backup quarterback position for the Eagles. I don't know if it's really a competition or not, but apparently there are people out there in the national media, John, who have this idea that there is an actual competition going on between Nick Foles and Matt McMullen.
Well, I don't know who that is, but he's not paying attention because Nick Foles has not practiced for over a week, and he's distanced himself from Matt McMullen, if anything. I mean, Matt McMullen has looked not good in training camp. And, hey, you know, I expect Nick Foles to be back on Saturday when practice resumes. If he's not, I think then you start to question, is this injury a little bit more serious? To me, that's the only way Matt McMullen gets into a conversation. He just does not perform well. He's not in Nick Foles' class, and Nick Foles is the backup quarterback on this team. The only question is, do you keep 2 or 3? At this point, McMullen has performed. I would doubt the Eagles would carry 3 on the final 53. They'll probably only carry 2 and either use the practice squad spot on Dane Evans or somebody else that's cut somewhere around the league. But, yeah, there's no competition for the Eagles' backup quarterback, Jeff.
John McMullen with us, our 97.3 ESPN Eagles insider. He's also a national NFL columnist for FanRagSports.com. Johnny Mack, we had a guest on in the 2 o'clock hour from Wisconsin. He works in Wausau and covers the Packers on a regular basis. And as we went through with our question marks about the Packers and what we were expecting out of them tonight and what's going on with that franchise, he started to go down a line of dialogue that their corners were a real issue. And I just started laughing because I thought, you think your corners are an issue? Come cover this football team.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Eagles have probably the worst cornerback situation in the NFL, but he's not wrong. I mean, the Packers are at the bottom. They're certainly in the bottom 5. And that's been the issue in Green Bay. It's been quite a while now. That defense has not performed well. And Dom Capers has been sort of, to be honest, nothing more than a reputation over the past 5 years or so. And even some of the bigger names, you know, Clay Matthews, for instance, who, you know, casual fans around the league look at him like a superstar. He was awful last season. So they have a lot of issues on the defensive side of the football. Obviously, offensively, if they're not the best offensive football with Aaron Rodgers, they're certainly in the top 2 or 3, and it'll continue to go that way as long as he plays at the level he's playing at. But as far as getting over the hump and winning a Super Bowl, I mean, in a lot of ways, Packers fans are sort of very entitled because it's been a quarter century now. Think about how long a quarter century of Hall of Fame quarterback play uninterrupted. That's how long they've gone. And they've gotten only, and I put that in quotations, only 2 Super Bowl titles. So a lot of people in Green Bay expect them to win every year. And it hasn't gone that way recently because of the defense. And I think it's going to continue because they just don't have enough talent on that side of the football. So that's the issue.
John, going back to this game for one last question, out of everybody who is playing tonight, and especially the newcomers, whether they be rookies or veterans, who do you think actually has the most to prove starting with this first preseason game going into the regular season?
Well, I think most to prove because there's been so much talk about him in the off season and about how he's improved. I think it's Nelson Aguilar because he's got to prove he can do it in a game environment. I mean, he's always been a somewhat decent practice player. He gets separation. Everyone knows that. And for whatever reason, when the stage gets bigger, he kind of shrinks, to be honest, or he has in the past. And I think, you know, people are already chalking up as he's a replacement for for Jordan Matthews, who's been a very, very productive receiver in his first 3 NFL seasons. I think you have to see it. And really, it goes to week 1 of the regular season because, the preseason is just not that important. But it certainly starts tonight. You would like to see him catch the football well, because if you see a drop or 2 from Nelson Aguilar, then you start saying, oh no, and here comes the snowball running down the hill. So I think he needs to be consistent, and he needs to prove that.
John, switching over to the NFL at large, the NFL announced it's going to hire 24 full-time officials for a 1-year experiment. I don't know about you, John, but to me, this shouldn't be a 1-year experiment. This should be a permanent change, considering that if the NFL is serious about officiating on the field and making sure the calls are right, shouldn't there be people whose full-time job is focusing on that?
Yeah, I've been advocating that, writing about it for well over a decade. It's absurd that an industry, that generates $13 billion had part-time guys refereeing the games on weekends. And, whether it's Ed Hockley's a lawyer, having a high-paying, basically moonlighting job, that's the formula they went with. And look, when coaches talk about players, constantly they talk about how do they get better, repetition. Same thing with officials. There's no reason officials shouldn't be at every off-season activity practice, every mini camp, rookie camp, training camp. There's plenty of work for them to do, and as they're out there, it accomplishes 2 goals. They're getting repetition, so they're going to get better. And also the players, when they have real officials out there, they're going to understand how they call the game better, and they're going to be more prepared. So it would actually improve the product. They're finally taking a step in the right direction. They hired the first full-time officials last year. Now they're expanding it. Eventually, I hope it's every single official is full-time. That's the way it should be.
Speaking of rules, John, Solomon Thomas came out in a recent interview and complained about the league's rule that doesn't allow players, if they're from one of those different type of quarter systems like the Pac-12 has, where he went to Stanford, to go to voluntary camp and then go to mini camp because his school doesn't finish school until June. And he said it was very frustrating. It was extremely annoying. He thinks the rule doesn't make sense. Do you think the NFL would ever change that rule?
Well, I think it's a dumb rule. I agree with him, but I'm not sure who to blame. Should you blame the NFL or should you blame those stupid colleges on the quarter system? Just use semesters like everybody else. But from the NFL standpoint, they don't want to encourage kids to leave school. But, that's sort of what Rosen was talking about in college and football don't mix. If you're a top 5 pick like Thomas, obviously – football is your future. You should be able to leave. You should be able to do what you want and start your professional career. So I agree with the player. I wish, as I said, I wish Pac-12 schools would go away from that goofy quarter system. But I think, the NFL at the end of the day should leave it up to the player. And if they say, hey, this is my profession, I want to leave school early, and they're not going to graduate anyway, they should certainly have the option to do that.
What we saw last night in the Texans-Panthers game from 2 rookies, at least what I saw, was you saw Christian McCaffrey run between the tackles. He ran hard, and he actually got frustrated a couple times when he didn't get more out of those runs. And then you saw Deshaun Watson show a lot of patience and some pretty solid decision-making overall. Do you think for what we saw from the rookies last night was a sign of things to come, or do you think that's just, well, they were playing against second and third team guys, so we can't read too much into it?
Well, I don't think you can read too much into any preseason game. I'm on record that, but both of these guys are extremely talented. I need a preseason game to understand that. I think it would have been very, very interesting if Christian McCaffrey lasted to 14, because I think the Eagles would have selected him I think he's a spectacular player, but the only concern is he's not that big. And while he can run between the tackles, that's not the issue. The issue is, can he hold up physically? Can he touch the football 20, 25 times a game? Because if he can, with his skill set, he's Le'Veon Bell. That's the type of running back he could be because of his receiving skills. You go back to the Combine, there were scouts at the Combine that said he was the best route runner at the Combine, and he's a running back. He ran routes better than receivers. So he's spectacular. The questions with him are all about, can he hold up as a feature back in this league? As far as Watson, I mean, he's got everything you need to be a successful quarterback in this league, but you got to pump the brakes a bit because he comes from Clemson. You know the type of offense they ran. He wasn't asked to do basically anything as far as reading defenses, as far as going from progressions. The route tree there is very, very limited. And all of a sudden he goes to Houston and Bill O'Brien. It's a traditional pro offense. So there's going to be some hiccups, but you could see his playmaking ability. I mean, he's one of those guys that can make something out of nothing. And that differentiates him from Tom Savage. And that's a team that is a legitimate Super Bowl contender if they could get competent quarterback play. So it's going to be interesting to see how they go. But I think Watson put himself in the conversation to be the Week 1 starter.
Transitioning back over to our division, the Cowboys. Sean Lee apparently has some hamstring tightness, and it may keep him out of practice for at least another few days. You know, Sean Lee is a guy who's missed a lot of time over the years due to injuries. Is he pretty much the guy that if they lose on defense this year, that defense is going to go from being okay to just bottoming out?
Well, I mean, I always give Rod Marinelli a ton of credit because they always seem to be better than they should be talent-wise defensively, and they probably will be again because he's one of the best defensive coordinators in this league. But forget about Lee. Lee's probably their only top-level player now on defense where you can look at him and say he's a really, really good player. If you saw Crawford go down in camp earlier this week, I mean, people were panicking like they lost Reggie White in his prime. I mean, that's because they have nothing else up front. And it's been an issue for a number of years. Now, part of it is they keep getting guys suspended. Randy Gregory, DeMontre Moore, over the years, you know, before DeMarcus Lawrence, you had Rolando McClain when he was there. They've had multiple suspensions in their front seven for 3 consecutive years. And Marinelli keeps doing it with mirrors. So I give that guy a ton of credit.
He is John McMullen, covers the NFL for FanRag Sports. He's also our Eagles insider at 97.3 ESPN.com with all the latest news and updates. John, it's the preseason, so we're not going to ask you who you think is going to win the game today because it doesn't really matter.
Yes, it does not. Yes. And I'm glad you said that because, yeah. But I'll tell you what. Let's go Eagles 20, Packers 17.
Sure, why not? It'll probably be like 40-35, and we'll forget that we even said this today. So,
yeah, thankfully.
John, take care.
All right, thank you, guys.